ideas of ethics and principles and guilds and things like that to working with people to some of those invisible structures, because that's kind of essential to doing that work well in a city. And so that's kind of why I'm here.
My name is Stephanie Syson. I manage the Central Rocky Mountain Permaculture Institute in Basalt with Jerome, who spoke yesterday. Yeah, people guilds are really important systems to have in place. We have a very small situation at Crimpy, and bringing the right people in could really take us forward. So I'm very interested in how people work together and how people communicate well to each other to get the most beneficial situation for whatever they're doing.
So yeah, we're basically going to be doing some talking for the first part of this hour and then kind of make it a little bit interactive for the second half. But both sections are going to be about this idea of what we're calling a people guild. So it's, you know, the theme of this year's Convergence is building the guild. And so we thought we'd take that, we kind of build upon that idea of the plant guild and talk about how some of the similar concepts can apply pretty directly to how we work in groups, whether those groups are people we live with, our family, people we work with, people we're doing, you know, activist work with, people we're designing with. No matter where you live, even if it's kind of in the middle of nowhere, chances are you're working with other people on a regular basis. And how you work with those people, how you communicate with them, how you get things done with them, is a design process in the same way that planting a garden is a design process. And so we can apply some of those same principles to how we do that work. And so, you know, it's one of those things that is kind of at the growing edge of permaculture in, you know, figuring out how to very kind of concretely apply some of these principles. And so that's, you know, certainly in me and Stephanie's growing edge as well. And so we're kind of working out these theories ourselves, so we definitely welcome your guys' input and ideas and feedback and advice as we kind of go through this hour together. So I think we wanted to start with just kind of talking about invisible structures as a whole and what those mean and ways to start kind of thinking about what some of the kind of big principles of invisible structures are. So, you know, to define invisible structures, it's a term that comes up a lot in permaculture, but if you haven't taken a PDC, or even if you have, you might not be familiar with it. They're essentially those intangible elements that are necessary to the functioning of a healthy system. So all the things that you can't see in a system, but that are just as important to make it work. And so as permaculture designers, we want invisible structures that are regenerative, just like our physical structures. So we want those invisible things to be things that are taking care of themselves, at least in the long term. They might not be that way at the get-go. But we want to design ways for people to interact with each other, leadership systems, governance systems, that don't require the constant time and energy of one person. So that, yeah.
So that goes off of like a guild. Most of you know what a guild is, why we would create one. There's certain elements we're bringing together. They're going to have different offerings and different needs. And so the same thing works with people. So we want to develop and design it well so that things are being provided for, all the needs are being satisfied without a lot of outside input, with them really taking care of themselves. And so it's really the same principles: your nutrient accumulators, your fodder crops, your nitrogen fixers, your big yield products, all coming together to create a synergistic whole that's better than the parts.
And so this is the idea where the people guild comes in. And so it's this concept of looking at the people in a group as different species in a system. And just as in a guild of plants, where each species of plant has something to contribute to that soil food web, each person in a collaborative group has something valuable to contribute. And so the design comes in understanding what each person's strengths and skills are and creating mutually beneficial interconnections rather than competition. So say, you know, instead of planting two nitrogen fixers right next to each other where they're going to compete with each other, you space them out. And similarly, in a people guild, if there's people with a similar skill set, you don't put them on the same thing where they're going to butt heads. Maybe you divide them up into different sections of what the group needs to do. And so it's amazing, the more I've started thinking this way, the more I can see there's just all kinds of immediate parallels to the way we forest garden and the way we kind of work together as groups. So there's kind of just a few other patterns in general that we wanted to talk about with people guilds. When you talk about kind of invisible structures and the way people work together, there's a couple kind of archetypal patterns of the hierarchy and the network. And hierarchical systems, top-down systems are ones that we're probably more familiar with in the society that we live in, where there's a very clear chain of command. There's often multiple levels of that chain, as in a big business or in government or army, things like that. And it's a very efficient way of doing things, but it's also very disempowering for the people at the bottom, and it can be prone to disaster if something happens at one of these crucial levels. If a big miscommunication happens here, or people are misusing resources, things like that, it can be very dysfunctional. Meanwhile, the network is one that's kind of more horizontal. People are on more or less the same plane, and that often leads to more innovation. It's kind of inherently more egalitarian, but it also has its challenges. It's less efficient because you have more of these connections. Sometimes it's hard to understand where the right decision-making structure is and who gets to decide if there's a conflict in that group. And so each of these different kind of archetypes, neither of them are inherently good or bad, but they each have their roles. And so part of the role of the designer in these invisible structures is an understanding where to apply this model and where to apply this one, and really how to interweave them, because in any invisible structure you'll see that there's elements of both of them, and sometimes you have a small network that's part of a larger hierarchy, or vice versa. Do you want to talk about the tyranny of structurelessness?
Right, so, and this kind of got brought up yesterday as well. There's an idea that as opposed to all this structure and government and how it's so oppressive, and that we want to go the other way and say, well, we can just all do what we want and it'll all be right and we'll all pick up and put in and it'll work out. But that doesn't tend to happen. This theory of structurelessness, there's going to be structure. People get together, they're going to create structure. We're either going to talk about it and put it on the table and clearly lay out what our structure is, or there'll be little subtle structures that come into play. People have different strengths, people are organizers, people are leaders, and that's going to come out whether you design for it or not. But is it going to, are we just going to say, oh, everybody's just going to do whatever they want and let those little things be invisible and let us not talk about them and let little power struggles go on? Or we're just going to put it on the table and design for it. There are people who are prone and good at these certain positions, and so let's just be transparent. Let's design for it so that everybody can work together.
So in some ways it's kind of, the tyranny of structurelessness is like assuming that every plant in a forest garden does the same things and requires the same amount of light and the same amount of water, and so we should just all plant them wherever and they'll all be happy together. But really, as we know, in permaculture, it's about thoughtful application of these, it's about embracing that diversity and using it to our advantage through thoughtful design and really taking our time to understand the different needs and yields of these different systems. And it's not just about mishmashing them all together, but creating a network where each interconnection is on purpose. And so that's kind of the idea behind, getting away from that tyranny of structurelessness, is creating a structure that is, if we want it to be egalitarian, then it's egalitarian, but it's egalitarian in a very specific way, and that there is authority, but it's authority that's consented to, instead of authority that is kind of demanded from above. So I just wanted to talk real briefly about some of the different kind of archetypes of folks you might find in these people guilds. So, just as in a plant guild, you might have a kind of central tree and a dynamic accumulator and a nitrogen fixer and things like that. There's kind of a set of different roles that, might not be present in every single guild, but they come up often. So you might have a leader or an elder. And this is the person maybe that was kind of the initial impetus for the founding of whatever group it is. They're the one that has this big vision, and they're real kind of excitable and charismatic and things like that. Or alternately, you know, in the kind of elder archetype, they're just someone with a lot of wisdom that people naturally want to listen to and want to learn from.
Radicals.
Yeah.
Being another person. So a radical, people who just have crazy ideas and they're willing to go out on the edge, and they're not looking to be necessarily popular or the same thinking that's been done before, not repetitive. They're just they're really putting it all out there, willing to make a change.
And one thing that I think is really powerful is this relationship between the elder and the radical. I feel like they kind of balance each other out in a lot of ways, where the elder is someone, you know, that's been through the struggle and, you know, maybe started out more radical and has learned from their mistakes over time about what works and what doesn't. And then the radical is the person who's kind of always pushing the boundaries, always trying to find new ways of doing things that, you know, maybe the elder hadn't even thought of before. And so they kind of need each other in order to have the best functioning guild. There are kind of another axis is the kind of visionary and the implementer, right? You guys have all probably been in groups where there's people who have like lots of big cool ideas, and they're really good at coming up with cool ideas, but not very good at actually doing them, right? Follow through, yeah. And so it's good, it's important to have those big ideas, otherwise you don't have something to rally around. But then you also need those people who are able and talented at and willing to actually get that stuff done, which is, you know, 90% of the work. Just doing all the details of, you know, calling people or making spreadsheets or, you know, all that kind of mundane stuff, but that's really important. And so well-functioning groups have both of those, and both people are comfortable in those positions. You have anything to add to that part?
No, I mean, that leads right into the network weavers. So network weavers are really important. Not only are they able to weave your small network together and keep everybody kind of moving and talking, but they're able to take your group and move it out into the public. So to weave with the society at large, the community around you. You can only do so much good when you're huddled in a circle. And there's some people who are really comfortable in that circle, and then some people who are very outgoing and very communicative and want to bring in other people and share your message and have a lot of energy and enthusiasm and charisma, and want to bring your message to a larger audience.
And that's kind of a similar role, but slightly different, of the translator. The translator is someone who can take the kind of internal culture of a group and make it understandable to a totally different group. So it doesn't necessarily have to be literally translating from one language into another as much as translating from one kind of culture or subculture into another. And certainly, I know for me, living in a city where there's so many different types of people living in the same physical space, these translators are really important to, you know, take, say, an idea of organic food and permaculture, gardening, and make that accessible to someone who might not care about that, but cares about the health of their kids. And so if you can explain to them why growing a garden is going to save you money and make your kids healthier, then they can get on board with it. So understanding what a different community is interested in, what drives them, and how to take what drives this group and make them kind of see eye to eye. That's a really important skill.
I think translators is a hugely important skill. I really am fascinated by it. I really like to understand how different people hear the same thing, essentially, and how you can take the same message and repackage it so that it's not so immediately offensive. I think a lot of people, perhaps when they speak, and me sometimes too, we're more concerned with talking than we are for people actually hearing us. And the way you present your message based on that, do you just want to talk and say what you want to say, or do you actually want someone to hear you? Those are two totally different ways of presenting yourself. So I think that it's like Adam said, it's really important. You can say organic, and a lot of people will scoff at that. But then if you just say, well, like your grandma used to do it, it's not organic, it's just a word that we use now. Your great grandma used to do it this way. And then the barriers are broken down, and they can actually begin to listen and to hear what you're talking about.
So I think we wanted to move to talk about a few case studies of how Stephanie and I have observed these patterns, either working well or not so well, and how we could see them working better in situations from our own life. But before we do that, are there maybe one or two questions of stuff we've done thus far? Yeah, great.
I just had you put network weavers and translators as plural and leader, elder, and radicals singular. I don't know if that was a intentional or not. Okay. But I guess, and maybe we'll speak to this in the case studies. But it brings up the question that are there optimal kind of ratios or amounts of people, like you have one fruit tree, but you've got a lot of several comfrey plants, or you had one vining plant and several root crops, or whatever.
That's a great
question. Do you think
question.
that is a one-to-one correlation? Does that work out in people guilds as well, or?
Yeah, I mean, I could speculate on it, but honestly, my answer would be just as good as yours. So
Yeah.
I think that's something for us all to observe and see. Yeah.
I was wondering if you were going to address, as you go through the case studies, the issue of how to identify these people, because when you have a new group that comes together, you don't really know people, you haven't had an opportunity to see how people interact yet, and maybe you don't even know for yourself who you are, because sometimes you have someone who's never really participated very much, and then they find themselves in a very passionate situation, they kind of emerge into one of these roles in a really phenomenal way. And so, I know, when you're building a guild, like a new guild, you have to do a little bit of experimentation and things work and don't work. But I just was wondering if you would have any insight, or maybe if anybody later could contribute some insight into, if there are
That's a great point.
Identify.
And it's something I actually wanted to bring up and forgot, so I'm glad that you brought it up. There's kind of a process of how these groups form, and oftentimes we want to rush that process and get right to the kind of exciting stuff, but that really in any group there's a set of steps that a group has to go through in order to understand how people relate to each other and what those kind of unspoken or maybe explicitly spoken rules are, and where everybody is in that guild. And oftentimes people, it's called forming, norming, storming, and performing, right? Where a group kind of forms around some big idea, common theme. They create their kind of internal norms of what's okay to talk about and do in this group, and what behavior is kind of taboo. And then there's this process of conflict that's actually really necessary and important, of like where are the edges of different people interacting with each other, and what are the types of conflict that could come up, and how are we going to deal with them in this group? What is our pattern for doing that? And only once you make it through all of those three previous phases can you actually start performing, or doing the actual work that you were set out to do. So I think, I don't know if there's one specific way that always happens in a group, but it's important to recognize that does happen. There is this kind of loose time of people figuring out what their place is in a group, and if we're aware of that and conscious of looking for some of those different roles and who might be best at filling them, it's going to make our ultimate kind of performing stage that much more successful and maybe come a little bit quicker.
So there's an article I have in the car, I'll get it for you to bring it in, but it talks specifically to what you're asking. One is about using our skills of observation and not trying to force something right away, so observing each other, communicating with each other, but then also, once we figure out that we have these skills or talents, yes, we're kind of in that role, but not locking steadfast into it, having these points where you would then rotate around, or you would join someone else in your team to learn about what they're doing, because you may be really great at administrative skills and have this hidden talent that you never knew you had, and if you just get locked into that one position, then not only does the group not get to utilize that hidden talent you have, but you don't get to explore it either. So there's a balance between keeping people in the role that they're doing, but while allowing them to explore others to see what other talents either are hidden or undeveloped and come about later in time. So I'll get that for you.
So we'll have time for more discussion and questions a little bit later, but I want to make sure we get to some of these case studies and some of the interactive stuff we're going to be doing too. So hold your thoughts, because I'm sure they're good ones. So do you want to start with the case study?
Sure. So I'm going to go to one that probably works well in some places and not in others. My daughter goes to a Waldorf school, and they have some very specific organizational structures. They don't have a headmaster or a principal in the normal sense that a regular school would. They feel like a triad is better, and so they have someone that's a head of administration, somebody who is head of teacher and parent communications, and then someone that's a head of outreach, and that's my specific situation. But Steiner actually really just tried to design the first school like that, and so I'm just going to read a sentence that he wrote. A true teacher's republic, we will not be able to lean back and rest on the directives of a headmaster. We will have to bring to bear what gives each of us the possibility to take full responsibility for what we have to do, and each must be fully responsible. So it kind of, as a team, there are people who have skills and they join together to accomplish a greater goal, but they're all very responsible for their own role, and no one of them is saying and holding the other necessarily accountable like a headmaster would. It seems to work very well for them. The three different positions, and each school kind of does them a little bit different, but is a leadership role, which is the unifying force. So rather than a leader like we might think of them as a director and someone who orders people around, they're really meant to bring everybody together and bring everybody's great ideas and work into one cohesive whole that has movement. And then a management aspect, so somebody who's really good at managing the overall daily facilities, the people, and then an administrative aspect, because every business is going to have administrative needs and someone who needs to attend to those. So they're very, very specific that it's a collaborative path to finding a unifying force and a governance model that focuses on sustainability, accountability, and creativity being the three pillars of that. So the school that my daughter goes to, they seem to work really, really well together and do a great job at it. So that's an example of one that works well on a small scale, a group of three as the unifying force to lead a school.
Cool. So I'm going to share a situation I participate in where that I feel doesn't work very well, because it's kind of the tyranny of structure. It's a situation where I'm in a collaborative group that is so hamstrung by bureaucracy and regulations that it doesn't really do much. And that's Denver's Sustainable Food Policy Council. It's a group of, it's a great idea of bringing together people from city government and people who are farmers and people who are food distributors all together to talk about how to make Denver's food system more sustainable and how to kind of create a strong, resilient local food economy. And so it's this group that gets together once a month for a couple hours and is charged with kind of advising the city council and mayor on sustainable food policy. But the thing about the group is, one, they're kind of similar to a situation where there's a tyranny of structurelessness. There's not really kind of any people on the council that have more decision-making power than the others. And it's a pretty large group. It's about 25, 30 people. And so everybody is coming at it from a different place, and everybody has different ideas. And sometimes when you have all of these different ideas and no kind of way of sifting through them, it just becomes, design by committee and design of the lowest common denominator. What's the one thing that we can all agree on? Well, the city should purchase more local food, but it's too political to make it enforceable, so we should just say should. And so then it just becomes a recommendation that doesn't really have any teeth and doesn't drive any kind of meaningful change. And then in the meantime, there's like all these policies of how things are to be agreed upon, and the way it has to be framed in order to put it to the city that just make the process so slow that even if we did have policies that we were all really excited about and were pretty progressive, it would take a really long time for them to move through that whole process. So I still think it's a worthwhile group, and it's important to have groups like that, but that, from my perspective of analyzing these invisible structures, I'm seeing so many different connections and so much of, so many levels of this hierarchy at play that it's kind of the worst of these two worlds rather than combining the best of them.
The other example I have, which I'm intimately involved with, is at the Central Rocky Mountain Permaculture Institute. So Right now, the only constants are Jerome and I, and with a flurry of other extremely talented, wonderful people that come in and out. So for the things that Jerome has done there in the last 30 years are amazing, and he's really been all of these things at the same time. Now he's doing a little bit of these things, definitely the elder, and so I step in to help out with these things. I definitely, with the network weaver, the translating, the facilitator, administrator, all of that, and what happens though is how many things can you do at the same time well? You can't. One or two people trying to do all of these things and be a visionary and keep moving forward and progressing and helping people and all of that, things are going to get dropped, things are not going to get taken care of. I'm not the best at all of these things. I can do administration. It's not my favorite thing, and I'm not that great at it. I can get it done though. And so I do. But if I could have a computer tech person, I would be in heaven. That stuff, the website gets done, but it gets done adequately to move forward slowly. So that's really, we need a team. If we're going to progress and move forward and go from being marginal at some things, really great at some things, and really just moving the whole organization forward, we're going to need other players that have skills to contribute to that. So it's moving, but it's not a full guild. We have a couple things, and we need more guild members for sure.
So the last case study I'm going to share is the group that I'm most intimately involved with, which is the GrowHaus. It's a nonprofit in Denver that's kind of in a big old greenhouse, and we do a bunch of things there. We grow food commercially, we teach about food through a number of different workshops and things like that, and we distribute food to folks in that neighborhood because there's not much access to healthy food in that part of town. And so I'm going to share kind of the process of how those structures got built out to where they are today. And so the whole thing started with a kind of elder, or you might say a visionary, who's this real estate developer in Denver who had a passion for local food and social justice. And so he bought this building, and then, you know, being this person in a position of authority and dealing with a lot of different projects, you know, he didn't have the time or knowledge to actually get a lot of it done. And so then he was introduced to me, and I started becoming more of that, you know, kind of administrator or network weaver, and starting to kind of bring people together. So I got, you know, at first we were kind of this loose network of people that were all kind of working together on a volunteer basis to kind of figure out what needed to be done and get things off the ground. And then we started applying for grants, we got our nonprofit status, and we had to organize a little bit more formally. And so then it shifted to this other structure where the original visionary became one of the members of the board of directors, which is, you know, kind of its own little network that reports to an executive director, who reports to a staff, which is a little bit more of a hierarchical structure. And then at that point, I decided that I actually didn't want to be in this role, even though I kind of, in the network version, I'd been kind of serving as that coordinator. I wanted to be in the staff in a specific position that would kind of fit my particular strengths better. And so we hired someone else as the executive director. The board, you know, meets with him on a regular basis, and then I work real closely with the executive director. And even though formally there's kind of this hierarchy going on, we're a much less kind of hierarchical organization than other, you know, institutions you might be familiar with. So ultimately, he has the decision-making power for the big decisions, but that he trusts, you know, me and another staff person who's in charge of growing commercially, and we have 2 staff people from our neighborhood that he really trusts to give feedback on what the community is thinking. And then from there, you know, we work with a whole set of interns and volunteers, and similarly, they're kind of in their own little network, communicating with each other and solving problems on their own, and then kind of taking big ideas and direction from the staff and executive directors. So you can see there's, like I was saying before, there's these 2 models of the network and hierarchy are kind of always shifting and interrelating with each other. And as an organization grows, it's kind of just important to understand, like, okay, is this a situation where I really need to just be telling people or giving them some direction? Or is this a situation where I want to step back and let the group wisdom kind of shine through because I'm not necessarily sure what the best role is? So that's kind of it for the case studies. So now we wanted to move to doing a little bit of kind of one-on-one discussion. So if you all want to find someone sitting next to you or near you that you didn't come here with, that you don't know very well. So pair up, find a partner, and we're going to ask you guys a few questions. It's a book called The Empowerment Manual. Starhawk's an amazing writer, and the way she chose to write this book is there's kind of this fictional narrative of a group that's going through conflict and how it solved it, and that narrative serves to highlight different things she's talking about kind of in a prose, nonfiction way throughout the book. It's filled with lots of really good exercises for groups to partake in and lots of really good practical advice. This is a book called People and Permaculture that just came out this year, and I actually just got it in the mail a few days ago, so I haven't even gotten a chance to really dig into it. But from what I can tell, just from skimming it, it looks really cool. What's that?
Who wrote that?
It's a woman named Luby McNamara. And you can order it, there's like a British permaculture, she's British, and you can order it from a site online that they can ship it to you from. But similarly, it's filled with lots of different kind of case studies and exercises. This one in particular focuses on a specific kind and size of group that many of us are familiar with, and then this one kind of takes it everything from that kind of zone zero that you were talking about to how we work globally as a society in groups billions strong. So they're both kind of really great ways to kind of start mapping out these permaculture ideas onto collaborative groups. I know you have a few resources.
I do,
as well.
and so they're not necessarily relegated to the permaculture realm, my recommendations. There's a really good, it's an older book, they've redone it probably 1,000 times now, and it's the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And one of the kind of thing, at least in the permaculture design course I took, and probably a lot of others, is that permaculture is a big thing, and we unapologetically take from other sciences and other organizations and take what we want from it. And so there's lots of these things out there. The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, those are great for yourself personally. They're also great when you bring them to a community. Another one is nonviolent communication. They've got them with family, with children in schools, kind of everywhere you would go with that. But communication really, none of this works unless we're listening to each other and talking to each other and talking from a place of openness and honesty, and really allowing someone to speak and listen to them without all of our preconceptions coming into play. We went to a TEDx last night, and I was looking for a way to bring one of these people into this conversation because it was so mind-blowing. But this one woman spoke, and she wrote a book on the colony bee collapse, and she's an environmental journalist. But her big point, so she starts going into these things on fracking and Monsanto, but not kind of, keep an open mind, it's not that bad, this kind of thing. And my environmental side is like getting agitated and not really wanting to listen to her. And, Monsanto is just bad, they're evil, that's just what it is. And so she brought up just that these are complex problems. And you really have to listen to the other side. You really have to listen to everybody to be able to hear what's going on. And there was a really great quote I actually read on the way here. It was, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. So to think that we know, just because, I don't like Monsanto, so they're obviously wrong, they're obviously responsible for colony collapse, and that's that, simple, done, clean. And it's just not, usually. And the more people we get involved in the conversation that we're actually listening to, probably the more creative and true our solution is going to be. That's all I have.
Okay, well, thank you guys.
Thank you.